Good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Luscri, and I'm the co-curator of the series that this film is screening in, Unknown Pleasures, with Bill Mazoulis, who's a wonderful independent filmmaker who's currently residing in Adelaide, but we put these screenings on once a month. It's an enormous pleasure to be able to screen this film, Senses of Cinema, which is a long in the works documentary about the history of the Australian Film Co-ops, co-directed by John Hughes and Tom Zubrycki, who's currently in Tahiti screening the film. So generally the way that we're going to run this, we've got John here as well as Ivan Gaal, who's also a wonderful filmmaker we've screened his work before, and he's also featured in the documentary. So what we're going to do is we're going to screen the film, and then after the film we're going to do a Q&A for about 20-25 minutes. So highly recommended for you guys to stay after that, because it'll be a very interesting talk. Thank you.
I was an 18-year-old boy at Barker College private school in upper North Shore of Sydney. I escaped from Wahroonga into the inner city and was wandering around in Glebe, and I saw on a telegraph pole this poster, Underground Cinema. Well, I had no idea what underground cinema was, but the word underground was enough to convince me that I should go to the Union Theatre at Sydney University the next Sunday to see whatever underground cinema was.
Down into a new world. A world of experiments and experiences. For the word underground has a special meaning in the film industry. Literally, it means operating outside the commercial industry. Actually, it's something more than that these days.
That was us, and we were underground, we were in a basement.
It's a multiple consciousness film in which the experiment is an experiment in perception. I discover something about them and about the way of looking at things through the way the camera is used and the situations that arise when we're filming. There's no script to it.
There was very few Australian films, and they're all imitation Hollywood features when they were made. And here was something that was very, very different. It was Australian life, and it was the life of young people.
Okay, thank you everybody for staying. It's almost a full house, which is great. I'd like to invite John to the stage, and I'd like to invite Ivan. Where are you, Ivan? There you are.
Oh, okay. Always do it, I'm told by Ivan.
I think you could try and get up.
Oh, you'll be okay.
These are very, very high chairs.
And I'm very short.
So I suppose, I mean, there's such a kind of rich and detailed history behind the co-ops, not only the Sydney and Melbourne co-ops, but also concurrent co-ops that were happening in London, in Austria, and kind of all around the world. And you cite Jonas Mekas, of course, at the end of the film in the in memoriam section, because he passed away a few years ago. I suppose that the sort of the first originary, I suppose, question to ask that maybe precedes the co-op is, you know, for those in the audience that maybe aren't as involved in that history as you have been, John, what were some of the preconditions leading into the co-op in the 50s and 60s? In 30 words or less.
Yes, that's a very big question. But first, just to go to the head of your statement, Jonas Mekas is in the credits at the end, in those who are no longer with us list. Those are there are a number of international figures there whose works were part of the Sydney Co-op catalogue. So that's why they're there and others aren't, so to speak. Well, how would you characterise the independent film movement and its collective practices before Ubu Films and the Sydney and Melbourne co-ops and the co-ops in Brisbane and elsewhere? I suppose you would want to look first in Australia to the Waterside Workers Federation Film Unit, perhaps, as a structured group of people with a particular imperative which was not commercially driven. But you also just look at the organic emergence of people who were interested in making independent work in Melbourne and Sydney. You think of the Peter Tammer, Ivan Gaal generation, for example. And in Sydney, of course, there was similar groups of people who were interested, who were making short films outside of that co-op system. Does that come close to?
I think so. I mean, there's also obviously in Melbourne that you know, you cite Nigel Buist's wonderful documentary "Come Plus Guy Equals Cinema," which is you know, preceding this film, probably the most important audiovisual document. So then there's the broader question of you know, as you cite earlier in the film, with certainly in Sydney, the kind of more educated, middle class white male filmmakers, for instance, like Albie. And the concurrent kind of movements here in Melbourne with the Melbourne University Film Society, which subsequently became the Melbourne Cinematheque, and there were a whole bunch of filmmakers here who were making films, and they didn't necessarily cross over into the co-ops themselves, did they?
You're thinking of Giorgio Mangiamelli.
No, after Giorgio, because of course, you know, Giorgio never sort of fit into either of those camps, I suppose, mainly because he was a migrant, but also because he was making films earlier than anybody else really was in Australia.
He's absolutely a key figure in all of this, and fortunately his work to some extent is recognised with some publications and exhibitions.
And Ivan, can you describe, you speak to it a little bit in the film, but can you describe the kind of the first moments that you started exploring film in Melbourne with people? Because you mentioned being very, very actively engaged in cinephilia. I mean, you mentioned to me before Pasolini and Antonioni and Godard and Truffaut and those filmmakers. How important was the culture of film watching in the initial stages of the co-op as much as filmmaking?
Well, yeah, we talked about that. That for me, as a late comer to the Melbourne Filmmakers Cooperative, I wasn't able to be as friendly with everybody as I should have. So I was a bit late coming in the mid-70s. And I remember my first film that I made independently, the Camberwell Junction, that I thought that was the first outlet. And like Gillian Armstrong, you know, said, my films are loved and all that, but that's how I felt about it, that I could go and show the film after I made it, because really not many people were interested in experimental film really at that time. But anyway, the issue was that to me, the Melbourne Co-op was also giving me the ability to see films from overseas that normally we wouldn't have seen it in other cinemas. And the Melbourne Filmmakers Cooperative was very active in showing films and feature films, you know. I mean, I remember seeing Godard's The Gospel According to St. Matthew's, and even today, after 50 years, I still have the images in my head. I mean, I never forgot that experience, you know, that to see these films coming from overseas and nobody else is showing them, you know. So Godard films, the one about the Rolling Stones, you know, the Sympathy for the Devil. I mean, I sort of didn't understand it at first, but when I read about it, I realized it was about the world that I lived in, you know, the Stalinist era, and actually the atrocities that Stalin was creating in the 30s, you know, and it's all there. So that's the sort of issues that I could explore for myself. And we had, I'd like to mention actually a very good projectionist who's now dead, David Thomas, who was virtually living at the co-op, you know, with his partner Vivian and the dog Tiger. And I just have 50 years old, all the images coming back, seeing him and working tirelessly in the bio box. And actually I got his cousin here, Laurie Balmer, who knew him very well, and David introduced him to the film world as well. So I'm very grateful that he was around at the time, and he could show us all the films that we wouldn't have able to see it otherwise. Antonio, Godard, you know, very, very, I mean, what else can I say? To me, the co-op was giving me ability to show my independently produced works and also seeing films that I wouldn't have otherwise seen. Do you agree, John? But what's your feeling about the screening part? It was very strong, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
A lot of feature films from Europe. How did we got those films, do you know?
Well, the National Library's film study collection was always very good, and there was quality films. A lot of radical American cinema and Russian cinema came from quality films in Sydney. But yes, I remember I was introduced to the free cinema movement, the British free cinema movement through the co-op screenings, not to mention John Jost and others, etc., etc., etc.
So the first exposure to films by people like Richard Leacock, etc., all came through the co-ops, would you say?
Well, for my experience in Melbourne, yes, certainly. Yeah.
And I suppose that also, leads to another point, which is the question of the way in which the co-ops helped to ferment a different kind of understanding of cinema that wasn't necessarily bound by certain kind of hierarchical rules, because many of these films were made under completely non-industrial contexts, whether that be artistic contexts or activist contexts. And I think we've always kind of struggled in Australian society to break down these kinds of hierarchies, both in our political sphere and in our filmmaking. It's not an accident, I think, that there was such an explosion of activity in this space, concurrently with workers' rights, women's liberation, LGBTQIA, First Nations activism. These things all tend to sort of compound around the same sort of 2 decades of history, and the ramifications can be felt now. So, I mean, it's a lot you've bitten off in the film, really, because it intersects with so many different other kinds of histories. And how did you choose to give the film... At what point did you start noticing patterns in the way in which the narrative was taking shape? That's a filmmaker question, but also a historiographer question.
Well, it's troubling question to juggle. Really, I suppose it's about a whole series of exclusions in many ways. So we were interested in positing a particular chronology and a series of phases in the progress of the Sydney Co-op in particular, which represented certain periods that were characterised by dominant political imperatives, and the gradual move from that kind of anarchist 60s countercultural movement through to really what was a kind of a neoliberal influenced concession to the centrality of the market. So that's one of the trajectories that's taking place. But the other thing, I suppose, was to try and select those films and filmmakers who were delivering a very personal voice and an alternative aesthetic that was dealing with the subject terrains that we thought best represented those movements. I don't know whether that comes anywhere near addressing the depth and breadth of your question, Chris.
I think it does, because, I mean, one thing I noticed in the film structurally is that every 7 to 10 minutes there's a new film or a new practitioner rears up, and sort of that becomes very much the central focus for a while, whether that be Ningla A-Na or We Aim to Please, for instance, or My Life Without Steve. Each time you posit a certain kind of political moment, whether that be something that ties in with the formless names of the filmmakers behind the co-op themselves, or whether it ties into a broader political movement, there seems to be a film that correlates to that. So it seems like you've managed to map that onto the structure of the film quite carefully.
There'd be choices other people could make quite different.
Yeah. But are you
films
also
if you take the body of work that's constituted by the Filmmakers Co-op catalogues, there's a lot of a lot of possibilities there, and in fact, it would be wonderful to see those catalogues aggregated in some way, because at some point early on in trying to develop and finance this project, I was talking about the materials that are aggregated in the catalogues as an invisible archive, because they're so radically dispersed, whereas the collections that are made by corporations and the collections that are made by government agencies or that are made by government broadcasters or public broadcasters are collated. They're accessible, you can read them as collections, whereas independent film, like working class art production in general, I suppose, dissipate and are not collected and celebrated in the institutions of collecting institutions in quite the same way. So when the Sydney Co-op closed, we were very keen to see the materials that were collected and went to the National Film and Sound Archive to be annotated as the Co-op collections, but that has yet to happen.
so
But
they
it can
can
happen
be
in the
tagged
future.
in a way as one collection.
That's right. So we do, I mean, the catalogues exist and they're not hard to find, but they're incredibly diverse.
I suppose some basic facts then. How many films would you say from your research were made during the co-op period by co-op filmmakers?
Several hundred, if not over 1,000. And there are so many films that it would have been wonderful to be able to mention here for all those reasons that you were talking about before, to what they evoke. And the one that comes most strongly to my mind lately is Delmas.
Yeah, indeed.
Because of partly because of the passing of Bert Dealing recently. So there are things that are continually coming up that draw attention to the absences and the absence of Delmas. Because Delmas was the film that was screened when the Sydney Co-op opened its new cinema in St Peter's Lane. The first screening was a Nigel Buist film and Delmas.
Which is an extraordinary conjunction of films when you think about it.
Great conjunction of films.
I just want... seeing the film a couple of times now, John, I really enjoy Marta or Sarah saying that the Sydney Co-op was full of public school boys and good girls. You came and looking for a new lifestyle, rejecting the style, the strict family ties and a school discipline. And somehow, to me, that's interesting because the Melbourne Co-op wasn't like that at all. The Melbourne Co-op was really full of people who were thinking individually, and they were making their programs by themselves. Nigel, yourself, myself, and Tom Cowan. I mean, it wasn't really as cooperative, was it, as Sydney was? We were more individuals and more dedicated to our cause and our thoughts and our ideas. That's interesting to me that it came out today very strongly. So the film has a lot of subtext in it that really you get it when you watch it a few times. So
That's good.
You've done a good job.
Pleased to hear that. Thanks, Simon.
And I suppose more broadly speaking, there are also arguments all concurrently throughout this period, both in the broader socio-political climate, but also embodied within the co-ops themselves, between different approaches to style, form, politics, activist filmmaking versus personal filmmaking, if you want to sort of draw an axiom between those 2 points so cleanly. And of course that's not as clean as that. But did you make very strategic decisions, John, about which of those arguments to foreground and which to elide, and how far you wanted to go by expressing some of those positions? Because I mean, it was obviously more fractious than you made it out to be in the film.
Yeah, I don't think there's... I think it's one could probably do a very close reading that would draw out some of that material. The only the conflicts or contradictions that are most clearly evident in the film are pretty simple. You know, the mainstream robust contradictions are evident, but those more subtle aesthetic arguments and their relationship with what was going on in the broader culture are not really examined. You'd need a book to do that, I think. To do that in any depth, and there probably ought to be. And certainly if you would turn your attention, for example, to film news, 20 years of film news, that would be one very productive resource to draw that kind of material out. And film news hasn't really been properly examined, I don't think, although there's some terrific books by Dean Williams and others about film theory and criticism in Australia.
And it was very equally robust during this period as well. Again, you cite Leslie Stern in memoriam section, and of course Leslie was also a very big supporter of your work during this period as well.
What about the people? Would they like to have some questions?
Yes, I think that's a good idea. So we're going to open it up for some questions, because I know there's a number of very fine filmmakers in this room, and thank you very much for coming. Does anyone want to ask any questions about the film, or ask John or Ivan anything? Yeah, hello.
Thank you so much for the film, guys. I was just wondering, bringing us to current day, what's exciting you about the Melbourne or the Australian film scene at the moment?
Well, I think it's fantastic that this film is screening here at Thornbury, I have to say. That's the first thing that comes to mind. I think Thornbury is great. And looking out here at the cinema, it's very reminiscent of the Co-op. It's about the same size as the Melbourne Co-op. And, it's probably maybe. But it's, there's a lot in common with the way that this series of screenings brings together a community of shared interests and people curious to see work that is often not available elsewhere. So I think the work that's being done here is pretty damn good. And there's also the film, the workshop that Giles and others runs. There's a lot of small community-based groups that are working in very similar ways to the way we worked in the co-ops, the same sorts of ideas. There's a lot of very strong independent documentary and drama being made, it seems to me, against enormous odds. So it's positive. What do you think?
I think it's exciting to be able to be back in a room together. As much as it's great to watch stuff at home, I feel like this is something that is vital to not just audiences but for filmmakers to be reminded that there's still a need for this and a want for this. So thank you. I hope that Central Cinema screens in all the film schools, and some of the clips of it reminded me of some of the films that I was shown when I'm coming in film school 20 years ago. And we thought, what the hell is this? And I hope for that reason that this screens and reminds students now who are often encouraged to or feel the need to make more work inside a box, to look at this work and be reminded that we should jump out of it curiously when we can.
Yeah, there's other ways to do things. That's Jen, is it? It sounds like Jen, yes. Well, also the series of screenings that you ran for work in progress, that was fantastic. That was a very innovative move. And it reminded me that we did that after the Melbourne Co-op closed down. We had a couple of goes at doing something very similar. One of them was called Just Another Film Society. And that was a small screening in near Princess Hill in Carlton, where people would screen works in progress in the same way that you did. So it continues. That was a couple of years.
I'm going to start doing Doc Record Hours again, by the way.
Great, good on you.
It was about 10 years of doing it, but I think it's time
Right, 10 years was it? Wow.
Huge.
We
Where'd you switch?
No, you're on. You're on.
am I on? Oh, I'm on.
You're always on.
Well, just can't forget it that we're really talking about something that happened 50 years ago, you know, and looking at the audience, I mean, most people weren't even born then, you know, and so you're looking back in time and you're hearing all these, you know, happenings and all that. I mean, does it bring anything to you? I mean, besides what you just thought would be fun, does anybody else get something out of seeing the past, the filmmaking process and the history of Australian independent filmmakers? I wonder.
Well, for me, I mean, and this is one of the reasons why, you know, I wanted to screen the film too, is that it's a reminder to me of the absolute necessity of engaging with film culture more broadly and not just thinking of yourself as a solo practitioner. And I think that one of the great lies that neoliberalism has taught us is that if you're not pursuing a commercial venture consistently and single-mindedly, you're somehow failing. So I think the vast majority of filmmakers that I see, frankly, coming out of the film schools these days, including VCA, are not that interested in more broadly speaking in film culture as much as they are in their own independent practice. And I think that's a shame. I think that's a failure of pedagogy. I think that's a failure of the defunding of screen institutions that we have in this country through the screen agencies. I think we have a widespread cultural failure around film culture more broadly in Australia, and I think that this film is a great, I suppose, example of the contrary to that.
Just like to know how many people here learned something new about the Australian film culture here. Put your hands up. Oh, great. Oh, look. Here you are, John. You want to thank them?
Yeah, sure.
So that's good to know that actually, you know, silent majority still
That's right.
actually
And
has
about the
something.
same size as a co-op audience too. So
Yes, it is, yeah. Just see a Goran film being projected, yes.
That's right. No, I think that's a wonderful note to end on, actually. Unless there's any... Yeah, one last question at the back.
From what you were saying, it's really, more broadly, it's about legacy and community.
For sure.
What you're presenting is just it's respecting what's come before, and I guess new filmmakers, yes, they can make their own work and see what's around them in the world, but it's appreciating where we've come from as a country.
That's it.
The ups and the downs. And I think kids coming out of film school are craving that too. I did a film last year where I went out to try to find director assistants to help, and a whole bunch of 21, 22, 23-year-olds were really wanting on set or in-person experience because they've been locked away for 2 years and they did film school through that. So they're craving that connection. So it was really wonderful just to have interaction with young minds and the curiosity about not just what I was doing, but my inspiration, the films that you're talking about, things that inspired me. So there is that desire. It's just providing a platform so they can get out and meet each other and learn from the generations that have come before. So
For sure.
Thank you for your film, and like Jen said, it's going to be a great tool just to get out to film schools and in schools in general, people become more aware about where we've come from.
It'd be good to see it as an organising tool, wouldn't it?
Yeah. What did you say?
Oh, I just said it would be fun to see this this film as an organising tool.
How would that work, do you think?
Well, just insofar as it presents the possibility of more collective solidarity among people to try and make changes to the way work is developed, financed and exhibited. That's always a possibility that is implied by the story told here.
Indeed. Ivan, you can have the last word.
Yeah, no, one thing interests me, John, is you work with Tom Zubrycki from Sydney. It's so two people making decisions. But it always peaceful, or you had to actually argue and
No,
work
it was very
for?
good.
It was
Yeah,
working.
it was excellent. No, it was very positive collaboration. It's very good.
Terrific.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Tom's in Tahiti and I'm in Thornbury.
Yeah. We're both very happy about it.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And yeah, please give John and Ivan a round of applause.
Artists Film Workshop was the name of the group that I couldn't recall a
That's
moment
right.
ago. The Artists Film Workshop.